What you just heard was the beginning of the end for Officer Derek Morrison of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. In exactly 47 minutes, Morrison's 23-year career would be destroyed forever when his commanding officer confiscated his badge and weapon at that very gas station. 3 weeks later, the county would pay Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams $850,000 to settle the federal civil rights lawsuit that followed. But Morrison didn't just lose his job that August afternoon. The man whose badge read, "To protect and serve," was ultimately sentenced to 35 years in federal prison for civil rights violations under color of law, a conviction that sent shockwaves through police departments nationwide. This is the story of a decorated Air Force pilot who stopped for gas on his way home from a classified briefing and found himself handcuffed on hot asphalt because one officer couldn't believe that a black man in a flight suit might actually be telling the truth. It's a story about assumptions that become accusations, about bias that becomes brutality, and about how one phone call to the right person can expose a pattern of misconduct that spans decades. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams, 42, had just completed his third combat deployment to Afghanistan, father of 2 teenage daughters, graduate of the Air Force Academy, test pilot with over 3,000 flight hours in F-22 Raptors, the kind of man who'd spent his entire adult life serving his country and who was about to discover that his uniform meant nothing to the wrong person on the wrong day in the wrong place. Before we continue with this story, I want to know, where are you watching from? Are you here because you believe in accountability? Because you want to see justice served? Hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what state or country you're watching from. The Chevron station sits at the intersection of Desert Palm Drive and Mountain View Avenue in Riverside County, California, a sprawling suburb where million-dollar homes overlook strip malls and chain restaurants. It's the kind of place where prosperity and poverty exist within sight of each other, separated by invisible lines that everyone understands but nobody talks about. On August 15, 2023, at exactly 3:47 inches the afternoon, the temperature hit 96 degrees. The asphalt shimmered with heat waves, and the smell of gasoline mixed with the desert air created that particular Southern California cocktail of progress and exhaust fumes. This wasn't a rough neighborhood. The Chevron sat directly across from a Whole Foods and a Starbucks. Soccer moms filled up their SUVs while talking on phones about tennis lessons and piano recitals. Landscaping crews took breaks in whatever shade they could find, their trucks loaded with mowers and blowers for the perfectly manicured lawns that stretched up the hillsides. The station's 8 pumps were arranged in 2 neat rows, covered by a canopy that provided blessed relief from the relentless sun. Security cameras mounted at every corner captured everything, the kind of comprehensive surveillance system that insurance companies love and criminals hate. But surveillance only matters if someone's watching. And on this particular Tuesday afternoon, the only eyes that mattered belonged to Sheriff's Deputy Derek Morrison, whose patrol car was positioned strategically in the station's far corner, where he could observe traffic patterns and run random license plates through the system. Morrison had been sitting there for 20 minutes, sipping an energy drink and scrolling through his phone, when a pristine silver BMW with government plates pulled up to pump number 6. Nothing unusual about that. Plenty of government employees lived in this area. What caught Morrison's attention was the driver, a black man in what appeared to be a military flight suit, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged wherever he happened to be. To Marcus Williams, it was just another Tuesday. To Derek Morrison, it was something else entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams had been 11 years old when he first saw an F-16 Fighting Falcon tear across the sky above his grandmother's house in Detroit. The sound hit him before the sight, that unmistakable roar of afterburners that seemed to rip the air itself in half. When he finally spotted the aircraft, banking hard against the afternoon clouds, he made a promise to himself that would define the next 30 years of his life. He was going to fly. Growing up in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood in the 1990s meant understanding that dreams required discipline. Marcus's mother, Angela, worked double shifts as a registered nurse at Detroit Medical Center, while his father, Robert, put in 60-hour weeks as an automotive engineer at Ford. They weren't wealthy, but they were determined. Every report card was scrutinized. Every grade below an A required explanation. Every opportunity was pursued with relentless focus. Marcus graduated valedictorian from Detroit High School for the Fine and Performing Arts in 1999 with a perfect SAT score and acceptance letters from 17 universities. But he only wanted one thing: an appointment to the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. 4 years later, Second Lieutenant Marcus Williams graduated summa cum laude with a degree in aeronautical engineering and orders to undergraduate pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi. He'd spent 4 years in the academic pressure cooker of the academy, where every day began at 0600 hours and ended with mandatory study hall, where upperclassmen could make your life miserable for the smallest infraction, where quitting was always an option, but never really an option. UPT was different. This was where they separated the dreamers from the pilots. 12 months of intensive flight training where a single failed check ride could end everything. Marcus flew the T-6 Texan II trainer like he'd been born in the cockpit. His instructors noticed everything: his smooth control inputs, his spatial awareness, his ability to think 3 steps ahead, even when pulling 6 Gs in a steep turn. But it was his performance in the T-38 Talon that earned him his dream assignment: F-22 Raptor training at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. Only the top 2% of pilot trainees were selected for 5th-generation fighters. Marcus wasn't just among the best, he was exceptional. Captain Williams spent the next 8 years at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, flying the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. He logged over 3,000 flight hours, including combat missions over Afghanistan and Syria. His call sign was Prophet, earned during a training exercise when he predicted an enemy's exact maneuver sequence 30 seconds before it happened. But Marcus wasn't just a pilot. He held master's degrees in both strategic studies and systems engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School. He'd completed the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base, where only 60 pilots per year were selected from the entire Air Force. He was a graduate of the Air War College, preparing for senior leadership roles that would take him far beyond the cockpit. His evaluations consistently rated him as definitely promote, the highest recommendation possible. He'd been selected for early promotion to lieutenant colonel, putting him ahead of 90% of his peers. His fitness reports included phrases like exceptional leader, strategic thinker, and the kind of officer who defines Air Force excellence. He'd received the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions during a combat mission over Syria, where his split-second decision-making had saved the lives of ground forces under fire. On August 15, 2023, Lieutenant Colonel Williams was driving home from Edwards Air Force Base after a classified briefing about next-generation aircraft systems. He couldn't discuss the details, not with his wife, not with anyone without the proper security clearances, but the meeting had gone well. His recommendations for pilot training protocols had been accepted. His reputation as a thoughtful leader and exceptional aviator was secure. He was wearing his green Nomex flight suit because he'd flown that morning a routine proficiency flight in an F-22 that had reminded him why he loved this job. The suit was comfortable, practical, and regulation. It identified him as aircrew to anyone familiar with military protocol. The name tape over his left breast pocket read, Williams. The rank insignia on his shoulders clearly displayed his lieutenant colonel status. He'd stopped at this same Chevron station dozens of times over the past 3 years. It was convenient, clean, and on his route home to the house he shared with his wife Sarah and their twin daughters, both high school sophomores with their father's sharp minds and their mother's determined spirits. Marcus had been married to Sarah for 18 years. She was a pediatric nurse practitioner who'd stood by him through 3 combat deployments, countless training exercises, and the demands of a military career that required excellence every single day. Their daughters, Maya and Michelle, were honor roll students who'd grown up moving from base to base, adapting to new schools and new friends with the resilience that military children develop early. This was supposed to be a routine stop. Fill up the tank, grab a bottle of water, head home for dinner. Marcus had no way of knowing that Deputy Derek Morrison was watching him from across the parking lot, making assumptions that would change both their lives forever. Derek Morrison joined the Riverside County Sheriff's Department in September 2000, 3 months after his 21st birthday and 6 weeks after washing out of his second attempt at police academy training in Los Angeles. The LA rejection letter, which he never showed to anyone, cited difficulty with cultural sensitivity training and challenges with de-escalation protocols. Riverside County was different. Smaller department, lower standards, less scrutiny. Morrison passed their academy on his first try and was assigned to patrol duty in the desert communities east of the city. For the first few years, he kept his head down, wrote traffic tickets, and responded to domestic disturbance calls without generating complaints. But patterns have a way of emerging. Morrison's first civilian complaint came in 2004. Maria Gonzalez, a housekeeper driving home from work, alleged that Morrison had pulled her over without cause, demanded to see her immigration papers despite her producing a valid California driver's license, and threatened to have her car impounded when she asked for his badge number. The complaint was deemed unsubstantiated after Morrison claimed he'd smelled marijuana in her vehicle, a claim not supported by any physical evidence or subsequent arrest. The second complaint arrived in 2007. Jerome Washington, a black electrician working on a new housing development, was detained for 2 hours while Morrison demanded proof that he belonged in the upscale neighborhood. Washington had been carrying his contractor's license, his electrician's certification, and a signed work order from the general contractor. None of it mattered to Morrison, who insisted on calling Washington's employer to verify his story. That complaint was ruled unfounded when Morrison's sergeant accepted his report that Washington had been evasive and suspicious. By 2010, Morrison had accumulated 6 formal complaints and dozens of informal grievances that never made it through the official process. Citizens called the department to report his aggressive traffic stops, his habit of detaining people for investigations that never led anywhere, and his remarkable ability to find probable cause to search vehicles driven by minorities in affluent neighborhoods. But Morrison was smart about his misconduct. He never used excessive force. He rarely filed false reports. He simply used his badge and his authority to humiliate, intimidate, and harass people who couldn't fight back effectively. His supervisors saw a veteran deputy with a clean arrest record and minimal use of force reports. They missed or chose to ignore the pattern of complaints that consistently involved the same type of victim: minorities in predominantly white areas. Complaint number 7 came in 2013. Dr. Aisha Patel, a cardiologist at Riverside Community Hospital, was stopped 3 blocks from her home while wearing scrubs after a 36-hour shift in the cardiac unit. Morrison detained her for 40 minutes, insisting that her hospital ID was fake and demanding to search her vehicle for stolen medical equipment. Patel's complaint was supported by security footage from a nearby business showing Morrison laughing with his partner while she stood handcuffed beside her car. That complaint finally triggered an internal affairs investigation. Morrison received a written reprimand and was required to complete 8 hours of diversity training. He returned to duty 3 weeks later with a clean slate and a growing list of citizens who'd learned to avoid any interaction with Deputy Derek Morrison. Complaints 8 through 12 followed the same pattern: a black real estate agent showing homes in an exclusive neighborhood, a Latino landscaping crew with proper business licenses and insurance, an Indian software engineer whose Tesla broke down in front of a country club where Morrison happened to be working security. 13 complaints in 23 years. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. Morrison's psychological evaluation in 2019, required for all deputies with more than 10 complaints, revealed a man with difficulty accepting authority, challenges from civilians, and heightened suspicion of individuals who don't conform to his expectations of community demographics. The evaluating psychologist recommended additional training and closer supervision. Instead, Morrison was transferred to traffic enforcement, where his interactions with the public would be more limited and structured. The transfer was presented as a lateral move rather than a disciplinary action. By August 2023, Morrison was a 23-year veteran with an exemplary arrest record, minimal use of force reports, and a reputation among his colleagues as someone who kept the neighborhood safe. His supervisors had forgotten about the complaints. His victims had moved on with their lives, but patterns don't disappear just because we stop paying attention to them. Marcus Williams pulled up to Pump 6 at exactly 3:47 p.m., his silver BMW still cool from the air conditioning that had made the drive from Edwards bearable in the desert heat. He stepped out of the car, his Nomex flight suit crisp despite the long day, and inserted his government credit card into the pump. From across the parking lot, Derek Morrison watched through his patrol car's windshield, his attention caught by something that didn't sit right with him. A black man in what looked like a military uniform, driving an expensive car with government plates, acting like he owned the place. Morrison had spent 23 years in law enforcement, and his instincts told him something was off. Military people didn't usually stop for gas in civilian areas while in uniform, and that flight suit looked too clean, too new, like something someone might buy online to impersonate military personnel. He decided to take a closer look. Marcus was squeezing the gas pump handle when he noticed the patrol car approaching. He'd grown up around law enforcement. His uncle had been a Detroit police officer, and he recognized the slow, deliberate approach of an officer conducting what the military called a reconnaissance by movement. No emergency lights, no urgency, just curiosity. Morrison parked his patrol car directly behind the BMW, effectively blocking it from leaving. He stepped out into the heat, his hand already resting on his duty belt, and walked toward the pump with the measured pace of a man who expected compliance. Hey! Hey! Stop right there! Marcus looked up from the pump, genuinely confused. He'd been filling his tank, not running anywhere. Sir, I'm just getting gas. Don't give me that sir crap. Turn around. Hands where I can see them. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been called sir by enlisted personnel for 15 years. He'd been saluted by junior officers across 3 continents. And now, this deputy was treating that basic respect like some kind of insult. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Lieutenant Colonel. I don't care what you think you are. You're trespassing. This is where confusion becomes accusation. This is where a simple interaction becomes something dangerous. Because Derek Morrison had already decided what he was looking at. A black man in a costume, pretending to be something he wasn't. Probably running some kind of scam in an affluent neighborhood where he didn't belong. This is a public gas station. I'm in uniform. That's not a real uniform. Stop resisting. Marcus felt his training kick in. Stay calm, de-escalate, follow lawful orders. But nothing about this felt lawful. He wasn't resisting anything. He was standing beside his car with his hands visible, speaking in measured tones, trying to provide information that would clear up what was obviously a case of mistaken identity. I'm not resisting anything. I'm an Air Force pilot. My ID is in my... Don't reach for anything! That's it. You're under arrest. The words echoed across the gas station parking lot. Other customers turned to stare. Someone started recording with their phone. A woman loading groceries into her SUV paused mid-motion, her mouth open in disbelief. For what? Disorderly conduct. Impersonating a military officer. Probably stolen valor, too. Morrison's hand moved to his handcuffs, his movements quick and practiced. This was the moment he'd been building toward, since he first noticed the BMW. The validation of his suspicions. The proof that his instincts were still sharp after 23 years. But Marcus Williams was not Jerome Washington or Maria Gonzalez or Dr. Aisha Patel. He was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force who'd completed survival training that included resistance to interrogation. He'd been shot at by actual enemies of the United States. And he was not going to be intimidated by a deputy sheriff who was clearly operating outside the bounds of reasonable suspicion. Sir, if you'd just let me show you my identification. Save it for the judge. Morrison grabbed Marcus's left arm, spinning him toward the car. The flight suit fabric wrinkled under his grip, and Marcus felt the cold touch of metal as the handcuffs clicked into place. The sound was sharp against the ambient noise of traffic and the hum of air conditioning units. This is where witnesses matter. This is where cell phone cameras become instruments of accountability. Because what happened next was recorded by no fewer than 6 different people from 6 different angles, creating a digital record that would eventually cost Derek Morrison everything he'd built over 23 years. You're making a mistake, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding multi-million-dollar aircraft and leading combat missions. My wallet has my military ID, my driver's license, and my government credit card. The car is registered to the United States Air Force. The plates are government issue. If you just... I said, save it for the judge, Morrison snapped, pushing Marcus harder against the BMW's trunk. The metal was hot from the sun, and Marcus could feel the heat through his flight suit. A woman approached from pump 3, her phone held high. Excuse me, officer, But this man was just getting gas. I watched the whole thing. He didn't do anything wrong. Ma'am, step back and mind your own business, Morrison barked, without looking at her. This is police business. Another voice joined in from across the lot. That's a real Air Force uniform. I'm a veteran. I recognize the flight suit. Morrison's jaw tightened. The situation was spiraling beyond his control, but backing down now would mean admitting he'd made a mistake. And Derek Morrison didn't make mistakes. He made arrests. The woman with the phone stepped closer, her voice gaining strength. Officer, your badge number is visible in my recording. This man has done absolutely nothing wrong. You need to check his identification before this gets any worse. I told you to step back, Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. This man is under arrest for disorderly conduct and impersonating a military officer. But it wasn't police business. It was something else entirely. It was the culmination of 13 complaints and 23 years of viewing certain people as inherently suspicious. It was Derek Morrison's bias, becoming someone else's nightmare. Marcus remained calm, even as the handcuffs cut into his wrists and the heat from the car's trunk radiated through his flight suit. He'd been trained for situations far worse than this. But what frustrated him wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the complete breakdown of logic and reason. Officer Morrison, he said quietly, I'm going to ask you one more time to check my identification. I am Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams, United States Air Force, stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. I'm a command pilot with over 3,000 hours in military aircraft. I stopped here to buy gas on my way home from a classified briefing. My wallet is in my right cargo pocket. My military ID will confirm everything I've told you. Morrison paused for just a moment, not because he believed Williams, but because something in the man's voice carried an authority that was difficult to ignore. But he'd come too far to back down now. Too many people were watching. Too many cameras were recording. Save it for the judge, he repeated. But this time, his voice carried less conviction. What Morrison didn't know was that Marcus Williams had made one phone call before approaching the gas pump, a routine check-in with his commanding officer, as required after classified briefings. And Marcus's commander, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, had just received a very interesting call from someone who'd witnessed the entire confrontation. Colonel Sarah Mitchell had been Marcus Williams' commanding officer for 3 years, and in that time, she'd watched him handle everything from equipment failures at 30,000 feet to terrorist threats in Syrian airspace. She'd never heard fear in his voice until he called her from the back of a Riverside County patrol car. Ma'am, I need you to know I've been arrested, Williams said quietly into his phone, speaking from the passenger seat where Morrison had placed him. I was getting gas in uniform, and the deputy believes I'm impersonating military personnel. Mitchell was in her office at Edwards Air Force Base, 47 miles from the Chevron station, when she received that call at 4:23 p.m. She'd been expecting Williams' routine post-briefing check-in, not a request for emergency intervention. Stand by, Marcus. I'm handling this. Colonel Mitchell was not someone who handled things quietly. As the commander of the 412th Test Wing, she had access to resources that most people never knew existed. She also had 17 years of experience dealing with civilian law enforcement agencies that occasionally found themselves in conflict with military personnel. Her first call went to the Riverside County Sheriff's Department watch commander. Her second went to the base legal office. Her third went to the public affairs officer, who would need to prepare statements if this situation escalated to media attention. By 4:31 p.m. Every supervisor in the Riverside County Sheriff's Department knew that one of their deputies had arrested an active-duty Air Force lieutenant colonel and was refusing to verify his identity. Sheriff Robert Martinez received the call from Colonel Mitchell at 4:34 p.m. He was in his office reviewing budget reports when his secretary told him that an Air Force colonel was on the line regarding one of his deputies. Martinez had been sheriff for 8 years, and he'd learned to recognize the tone that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Sheriff Martinez. Colonel Mitchell's voice was crisp with military precision. I'm calling regarding Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams, who appears to have been arrested by one of your deputies while in uniform and conducting routine business. I need this situation resolved immediately. Martinez was already pulling up Morrison's recent activity reports on his computer. Ma'am, let me look into this and call you back within. Sheriff, I'm not hanging up, Mitchell interrupted. Lieutenant Colonel Williams is a command pilot, a graduate of our test pilot school, and currently involved in classified aircraft development programs. He has a top-secret security clearance and was conducting official business when your deputy decided to arrest him for impersonating a military officer. I suggest you resolve this immediately." The line went quiet for exactly 15 seconds while Sheriff Martinez processed the implications. A false arrest of a military officer conducting classified work could become a federal issue. A federal issue could become a Justice Department investigation. A Justice Department investigation could become the end of careers. "I'm personally responding to the scene," Sheriff Martinez said. "I'll have this resolved within 20 minutes. At 4:47 p.m., exactly 1 hour after Marcus Williams had pulled up to Pump 6, Sheriff Martinez arrived at the Chevron station in an unmarked SUV with 2 patrol supervisors. He found Deputy Morrison standing beside his patrol car, still insisting that the man in the flight suit was running some kind of elaborate scam. "Morrison, step away from the vehicle," Sheriff Martinez ordered. Now, the body cam footage went viral within 6 hours. By midnight on August 15, 2023, the video had been viewed over 2 million times across social media platforms, with headlines that wrote themselves, "Deputy arrests Air Force pilot for wearing Air Force uniform and decorated combat veteran handcuffed at gas station for being black in uniform." The hashtag number Justice for Williams trended on Twitter for 3 days straight. Military veterans shared their own stories of discrimination while in uniform. Civil rights organizations called for federal intervention. Late-night television hosts played clips of Morrison demanding to see real identification, while Williams stood in an official Air Force flight suit with government-issued name tags and rank insignia clearly visible. The contrast was devastating. A decorated combat pilot treated like a criminal by a deputy with 13 complaints who'd never served his country in any capacity. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department received over 3,000 phone calls in the first 24 hours. The voicemails ranged from angry citizens demanding Morrison's termination to veterans organizations threatening protests. Local news stations played the footage on loop, with legal experts explaining how Morrison's actions constituted a clear violation of federal civil rights law. Derek Morrison was placed on administrative leave, pending investigation, at 11:15 p.m. on August 15th, less than 8 hours after Sheriff Martinez confiscated his badge and weapon at the gas station. The investigation, conducted by the department's Internal Affairs Division with oversight from the FBI, concluded after 6 weeks with a recommendation for immediate termination. The termination letter, dated October 2, 2023, was blunt in its assessment. Deputy Morrison's actions demonstrated a pattern of misconduct inconsistent with department values and constitutional policing standards. His arrest of Lieutenant Colonel Williams without probable cause, his refusal to verify readily available identification, and his escalation of a routine civilian interaction into a federal civil rights violation warrant immediate separation from service. But termination was only the beginning. The federal investigation revealed Morrison's 13-complaint history and triggered a comprehensive review of every arrest he'd made since 2000. The Department of Justice filed federal civil rights charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, which makes it a crime for anyone acting under color of law to willfully deprive a person of rights protected by the Constitution. The federal trial began on March 15, 2024. Morrison's defense attorney argued that his client had made an honest mistake based on reasonable suspicion. The prosecution countered with 23 years of complaint history, expert testimony about racial profiling, and the damning body cam footage that showed Morrison's refusal to examine evidence that would have immediately cleared Williams. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Their verdict? Guilty on all counts. U.S. District Judge Maria Elena Rodriguez sentenced Morrison to 35 years in federal prison, calling his actions a betrayal of the oath to serve and protect, and noting that the defendant's pattern of misconduct spanning 2 decades demonstrates a willful disregard for constitutional rights that cannot be overlooked. Marcus Williams filed a civil rights lawsuit against Riverside County 2 weeks after Morrison's arrest. The complaint, filed in federal court, sought damages for false arrest, denial of civil rights, and emotional distress. The lawsuit detailed Morrison's complaint history and argued that the county had been deliberately indifferent to his pattern of misconduct. Riverside County settled the lawsuit for $850,000 rather than face a trial that would have exposed decades of ignored complaints and inadequate supervision. The settlement agreement included provisions for mandatory bias training for all deputies and new protocols for verifying military personnel identification. The money wasn't what mattered to Marcus Williams. What mattered was accountability. What mattered was ensuring that other military personnel, other citizens, wouldn't face the same humiliation and violation of their rights. The ripple effects extended far beyond Riverside County. Police departments across California implemented new training protocols for interactions with military personnel. The California Peace Officers Standards and Training Commission added specific modules on recognizing military uniforms and identification procedures. Morrison's case became a teaching tool in police academies, a stark example of how bias can destroy careers and violate constitutional rights. Legal scholars wrote about the precedent set by his 35-year sentence, noting that federal judges were finally treating civil rights violations with the seriousness they deserved. For Derek Morrison, the man who'd spent 23 years wearing a badge that read, "To protect and serve," the transformation was complete. From deputy sheriff to federal prisoner in 8 months, from protector to predator. His appeals were denied at every level. His requests for sentence reduction were rejected. His petition for presidential clemency was ignored. Morrison would spend the rest of his productive life in federal prison, a living reminder that the badge doesn't grant immunity from accountability. The real question wasn't whether Morrison deserved his fate. The real question was how many other Derek Morrisons were still wearing badges, still conducting traffic stops, still deciding who belonged where based on the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. Marcus Williams testified before the Riverside County Board of Supervisors on November 14, 2023, as part of their review of Sheriff's Department policies. His statement, delivered without notes and broadcast live on local television, captured the attention of civil rights advocates nationwide. "I've served this country for 22 years, Williams said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "I've flown combat missions over Afghanistan and Syria. I've risked my life to protect the freedoms that we all enjoy. But on August 15th, I learned that my uniform, the uniform I've worn with pride in defense of this nation, meant nothing to Deputy Derek Morrison. I was humiliated in front of my neighbors, my community, and strangers who recorded my arrest on their phones. But more than humiliation, I felt something that I've never experienced in combat: helplessness. When you're flying an F-22 Raptor and enemy missiles are tracking you, you still have options. You have training, you have countermeasures, you can fight back. Standing beside my car with Deputy Morrison's handcuffs cutting into my wrists, I had no options. I couldn't defend myself without being accused of resisting arrest. I couldn't reach for my identification without risking being shot. I couldn't raise my voice without being charged with additional crimes. I had to stand there and accept treatment that violated every principle of justice and human dignity. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. Deputy Morrison had 13 complaints over 23 years. 13 times citizens tried to hold him accountable for misconduct. 13 times this department failed to take meaningful action. How many other Marcus Williams were there? How many other citizens were humiliated, violated, and traumatized because this department chose to ignore a pattern that was obvious to anyone willing to see it? I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm demanding accountability. I'm demanding that this board implement reforms that will prevent future Derek Morrisons from hiding behind badges while violating constitutional rights. I'm demanding training that teaches officers to see citizens as human beings rather than potential criminals. My daughters watched the arrest video on social media before I could explain what happened. They saw their father, a decorated military officer, treated like a criminal because of assumptions based on his race. What do I tell them about the country their father has spent his career defending? What do I tell them about the justice system that was supposed to protect their rights? I tell them that accountability matters. I tell them that change is possible when good people refuse to accept injustice. And I tell them that their father's humiliation means something if it prevents other families from experiencing the same violation of their dignity and rights. That's why I'm here today. Not for sympathy, but for change. Not for apologies, but for action. Do you think officers with multiple complaints should face federal prosecution for civil rights violations? Drop your answer below. Derek Morrison's conviction represents more than one man's fall from grace. It represents a fundamental shift in how we hold law enforcement accountable for constitutional violations. For decades, the doctrine of qualified immunity protected officers from federal prosecution, except in the most egregious cases. Morrison's 35-year sentence signals that federal prosecutors and judges are finally treating civil rights violations with the seriousness they deserve. But Morrison wasn't acting in isolation. He was the product of a system that repeatedly failed to address his pattern of misconduct. 13 complaints in 23 years. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern that should have triggered intervention, additional training, or termination long before Marcus Williams ever stopped for gas at that Chevron station. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department knew who Derek Morrison was. They knew about Maria Gonzalez and Jerome Washington and Dr. Aisha Patel and all the other citizens who'd filed complaints about his conduct. They had documentation stretching back 2 decades, showing a clear pattern of targeting minority citizens in affluent neighborhoods. Yet Morrison remained on patrol, carrying a gun and a badge, empowered to make arrests and conduct searches. This is where institutional accountability becomes personal responsibility. Every supervisor who reviewed Morrison's complaint history and allowed him to return to duty bears some responsibility for what happened to Marcus Williams. Every internal affairs investigator who ruled complaints unfounded without serious investigation shares culpability for the federal conviction that followed. The real question is, what changes now? Riverside County implemented new policies requiring automatic federal notification when military personnel are arrested. They've mandated bias training for all deputies and created new complaint review procedures. But these are reactive measures, responses to Morrison's conviction rather than proactive reforms designed to prevent future violations. Real reform requires cultural change. It requires police departments to view citizen complaints as early warning systems rather than nuisances to be dismissed. It requires supervisors to recognize that patterns of misconduct predict future violations. It requires honest acknowledgement that some officers shouldn't wear badges regardless of their years of service or arrest statistics. Because if we don't fix the system that created Derek Morrison, we're just waiting for the next Marcus Williams to stop for gas at the wrong place on the wrong day. The Morrison case exposed uncomfortable truths about how complaint systems actually function in many police departments. Internal affairs investigations that consistently favored officer testimony over citizen accounts, supervisors who viewed complaints as paperwork problems rather than early warning systems. A culture where 23 years of service created immunity from accountability regardless of constitutional violations. Morrison's conviction has already influenced policy in departments across California and beyond. His case has become a teaching tool in police academies, where recruits now study his body cam footage as an example of how bias can destroy careers and violate rights. His sentence has sent a clear message that federal prosecutors will pursue civil rights cases aggressively when the evidence supports charges. But individual accountability, while necessary, isn't sufficient. Systemic change requires sustained pressure from communities, elected officials, and citizens who refuse to accept constitutional violations as the price of public safety. Marcus Williams got justice. Derek Morrison faced consequences. Riverside County paid damages. But the next test case is already developing somewhere. Another officer with a pattern of complaints, another department ignoring warning signs, another citizen whose rights hang in the balance. The story doesn't end with Morrison's conviction. It continues with every traffic stop, every complaint review, every decision by supervisors to address misconduct or ignore it. Justice served isn't just about punishment, it's about prevention. It's about building systems that protect rights rather than violate them. Where are you watching from? What do you think needs to change in your community? Hit subscribe and let me know in the comments, because accountability starts with paying attention.